Welcome to the 8-Bit Instructor Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you level up your instruction in order to craft authentic learning experiences for both you and your students. I'm your host, Lee Tucker, a high school English teacher and ed tech enthusiast, and I want to join you on your journey to becoming the best instructor that you possibly can. So if you're ready, grab your adventuring gear and let's get going. Hey, what's up, 8-Bit crew? Today's Thursday, October 1st, 2020, and this is episode 10 of the 8-Bit Instructor Podcast. Welcome to October, everybody. We finally made it through September, and I don't know about you, but I'm tired. September felt very long, so it's nice to have a new month out there. Hopefully, all of you are doing good, even if you're tired and exhausted. Hopefully, things are going well for you. I've got a pretty quick but interesting episode lined up for you today. Later on in the boss battle, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the F word, and we're going to take a look at a really classic old school video game that goes along with that and how we can utilize some of those ideas in class. But first, we're going to go ahead and move along. I don't have a lot of news and updates today. I haven't looked a whole lot. Plus, there aren't a ton of updates going on right now at the end of September. So, without further ado, we're just going to go ahead and jump on over and open up the treasure chest and see what little treasure we have for today. Alright, so my tip for today is actually a keyboard shortcut in Google that works in a lot of Google apps that is a wonderful time saver, and that is just the keyboard shortcut Control-D or Command-D if you're on a Mac. Control-D is the duplicate shortcut, and so essentially what it does is if you select something and hit that, it's going to make an exact copy of that. I use it a lot in Google Slides particularly. If you click on a slide on the left-hand menu, it will duplicate the entire slide. But even within each slide, if you click on a shape or a picture or a text box or anything and hit Control-D, it will duplicate that. So it works in Google Slides, does the same stuff in Google Drawings, and it's really helpful, especially if you have formatted some different things where maybe you did a shape and you changed some colors, added text and all that kind of stuff, and don't want to go through that whole process again. Control-D is a really good, quick way to continue using that formatting without having to go through all the steps again. So keep that in mind. Control-D save you a whole lot of time in some of the different Google apps. So that's all for this intro segment. I know it's really short, but we're going to go ahead and jump forward and get geared up and ready to level up your craft, because next up is the boss battle. Alright, so today we're going to dive into the F word. You know which F word I'm talking about. It's the biggest one out there in the education world, and that's failure. Failure has become a profane word in our profession. Failure is unacceptable. We can't have students failing and all this kind of stuff. And it's not just in the schools, from administrators, from teachers, it's from students, it's from parents. This idea that failing is a terrible thing. And so what we want to look at today is how failure actually can be an option in the classroom. Because the problem that I've kind of noticed in the last several years is this idea that we expect perfection, whether it's teachers expecting perfection out of students, students expecting perfection out of themselves, or parents expecting perfection out of their students. The reality is that perfection is not the expectation. It's not possible. We're going to mess up along the way. And so the more important question in my mind is, can we learn from our failures when they happen? Not, can we prevent failure from happening? And to give you an example, I want to use a really old school video game to kind of set up this idea. So if you've been around and been anywhere near the video game world, you are very likely familiar with the Super Mario Brothers franchise. And I want to go back to the very beginning, the original Super Mario Brothers on the original Nintendo Entertainment System. And if you've played it before, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about when we talk about this, the familiar first level. So when you start out on the very first level, it's just the Mario character and just a flat path. And there are no directions, there's no tutorial, there's no anything that tells you what to do. It's just you start on the level and the timer starts counting down. And so you can go left, you can go right. If you go left, you aren't going to be able to go anywhere. So you start going right, and then all of a sudden this little guy starts coming along that looks kind of like a mushroom. Well, who is he? If we don't know anything about it, if we've never seen anybody play it before, we're just trying to figure this out by ourselves. Maybe I can run up and punch him. I don't know. And so you go, and when you run into that first little guy, you die. That's failure. But what happens after that? Well, you run forward again, you see that guy, and this time, instead of running into him, you jump over him, or you jump on top of him. That's learning from failure. You keep going, and all of a sudden you see some bricks and some boxes that have question marks on them. Well, what do those mean? You jump up into one, and out pops a little mushroom. Well, that mushroom looks kind of like the bad guys that just killed you, so what do? Do you get it? Do you not? All of this is a very simple way of looking at how failure can be used to help us learn better. And in his book, Stop Talking, Start Influencing, Jerry Cooney-Horvath, who is actually going to be on next week's episode, spends a whole chapter talking about failure and error, and won't get too deep into it in this episode, but the idea that is presented there is that failure and error make us pay attention to what's happening. And when we keep getting everything right and keep going along, we turn into this kind of coasting mode where we're not really paying attention to what we're doing. But then all of a sudden, when we make an error, our focus and our attention is turned to this place where we made that error. And so when we get there, we have two options. We can engage with that error, or we can ignore it. And the problem that I've noticed so often lately is that in the classroom, when we or students are met with error, we ignore it rather than engage it. So, a lot of times in my class, and this is probably very common for a lot of you as well, let's say I give something like a quiz. And when they get done with it, they get their score back. And let's say a student makes a 65. What's the first question they ask? If your students are anything like mine, the very first thing, before they even look at anything else, they ask me, can I retake this? And what I've started doing, among other things, is I've started asking why. Why do you want to retake it? Well, because I made a bad grade and it's going to drop my grade. And when I keep hearing that over and over and over, I see a problem with that, because there's nothing in their response to my question that has anything to do with learning. And if you remember, a few episodes ago where I talked about the history of grading and the idea that these percentage grades become the focus, and all of a sudden they don't want to take a quiz over because they want to learn the information better. They want to take it over just so they can get a better score so that their grade will look better. And to me, that's become a serious issue, because there is no learning going on there. It's just redoing something for the sake of improving a number. And so what I've started doing is saying, I ask them that question, well, why do you want to retake it? And then when we talk about the questions, I've started asking them, well, did you learn something from that? Look at the questions you missed. Do you understand that information better? And a lot of times I'll get like a positive affirmation, like, yeah, I noticed that. And so what I want to look at is how we can take something like failure and error and not performing perfectly on something in class and utilize that to help our students learn and grow. And the whole idea that comes from this is the growth mindset, which some of you may be familiar with. It's something that we've done training at our school in the last few years on. And the whole premise of growth mindset is to get students to focus on that learning process, on taking what they know, taking what they understand, taking where they are, and then growing from there. And I imagine most educators will agree to that. There's not many educators that I run into that are like, well, now I don't care about how much they grow. I just care about how they do on a test. Now, most of them want students to learn. They want them to grow. They want them to have a better understanding. But then something like the test, the grade, that number often gets in the way. So what I wanted to look at today is a few ideas on how we can use this whole idea of growth mindset, of error and failure and learning to fail, and utilize that in class to help our students become more successful. So the first place I want to start is just the idea that this is something that has to be set up as a culture, either as the culture of your classroom or hopefully even bigger, the culture of your school or your district or even by large our whole nation. This is not something that is just going to change overnight. This is a process that takes time, because if you think about what's happened to students coming into your class, they have been hammered over and over and over and over again that perfection is expected, that we work to be perfect, not just to learn and grow. And so it's going to take time. It's going to require patience. It's going to require a lot of conversations. It's not just this one-time deal where you tell your students at the beginning of the year, okay, we're going to work on learning from failure. We're going to take some risks. We're going to learn and grow. And they'll probably look at that and agree and be on board with it until they get that first grade. And then it's going to be, what can I do to get my grade up? What can I do to get an A or whatever? So we have to teach our students how to embrace failure, and we have to utilize, examples in class, and we have to take time to show them how growth can benefit them, how making mistakes can benefit them, how we can learn from it. And we have to shift that culture. The same thing's probably going to happen with parents as well. A lot of you've got those parents out there that, as soon as their child drops to an 89, you're getting an email or a phone call about why so-and-so has a B in class now. What can they do to get an A? And so, again, it takes time. It takes a lot of conversations, I've had more conversations with students and parents about this idea in the last month than I probably had in the last several years. And so it really takes time to shift that culture and get students, parents, teachers away from that kind of mindset of the end grade and look at the process that's involved along the way. Now, one thing that helps with doing something like this is that it does alleviate the stress of perfection. If you think about it, you think about how often students are stressed out about school. And if you ask them what it is that's stressing them out, it's probably going to have to be something centered around grades. I'm trying to get an A in class, or I'm failing class right now. I'm trying to get a passing grade. and all this kind of stuff. When we learn how to embrace that failure, the growth mindset, and learning from it, then we can start taking that stress of perfection off of our students' shoulders. You know, this idea of stress and anxiety and depression is really on the climb. I think about the difference between my students my first year teaching versus now, and that's one of the things that I've noticed is that they are so stressed out about tests and grades and getting into a good college and all that kind of stuff, and none of that is bad. Wanting to get into a good college is great. Wanting to get good grades is great, but when it becomes a point of stress, it starts to negatively affect their mindset, and then bad things can happen. That's why even something as major as mental health issues and suicide and depression can be often traced back to something like that. So when we do that, we can help alleviate stress off of students' shoulders to help them, learn and grow a whole lot more. So one thing I've learned to really be able to do that and help establish this mindset to change this culture is to work on making sure that we don't tie failure and mistakes to grades. So I can give students maybe a pretest and tell them that we're going to take those ideas, we're going to work on it, we're going to learn from our mistakes and all that, and then give them a post-test later. But if I'm putting those direct percentages into the grade book, I can tell them, you got 50%, we're going to learn and grow and build from it. But all they're seeing is that 50 that's in the grade book. So being able to do things to take off the effect that it might have on their grade is one way that we're going to be able to establish that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to fail. So think about ways that you can do something like that. Some stuff that I've tried recently is, one, just not giving the grade as a calculation in the grade book. So I've given some quizzes this year that I put in the grade book just so we can see the percentage, but I've been able to set it so that it doesn't actually calculate to bring up or down an average. And so by doing that, we can create this genuine atmosphere of, I'm not worried about what your percentage is, I want to see what you actually know. And then I'll sit down and kind of talk to them about that. Sometimes it might be something as simple as they read the question wrong. And when I sit down and talk to them about it, I realize, okay, they understand it. They just got the question wrong because they weren't reading. And we'll talk about what do we learn from that? Well, we learned we got to take our time. We got to read the question right. If they actually don't understand the concept, then I have an opportunity to sit down and talk with them to figure out what it is, where they're missing that knowledge, that understanding, and help clear that up. I might give them that same quiz, later on, just to see how much better we're doing, and say, all right, did we do better? Did we do worse? And typically we're going to see, improved stuff, because again, we're using those scores and questions to pinpoint the weak areas rather than just trying to get a grade. So try to take the pressure of the grading off. Don't tie it into grades. And if you do have to grade them for this, think about maybe doing something in a participation kind of aspect where they're getting credit for doing it, not necessarily how well they do on it. And I know there's always these, well, what about, if I give them a quiz and they know that they're getting full credit just for doing it, they're not going to try. And what I've found is, if you talk with them and are open and honest with them that you are using this to help them learn and grow, most of them will still try to do their best. Yes, you're always going to have students that work the system. You're always going to have students that are just going to do the bare minimum and all that. Nothing is a magic bullet in education when it comes to dealing with a couple hundred students in a classroom. So you can't look at that kind of thing. Let's look at what positive can come out of that. And most of the time, if you look, you're probably going to get way more positive benefits to something like this than negative benefits. And if you do have a student that's working the system, that's, having a conversation with them about it. Is, why aren't you giving me your best? And we can talk about it there. Another thing that is super helpful with doing this and super useful to do is to actually have students stop and reflect on their failure and their learning. So take a quiz example again. And what I might do, instead of having students retake the quiz like they want to, I might just tell them to stop and reflect on the questions that they missed and write out a short reflection on what did they miss, why they think they missed it, what did they learn from that. And by teaching them to stop and think and stop and reflect, we're teaching them how to it's that metacognition, that thinking about how they're learning, looking at places where they are weak and looking at areas where they do need to improve. And that can also be one of those accountability things for those students who are trying to work the system. If they know that they're going to have to do a reflection on every question that they miss, then they might be a little bit more likely to try their hardest on it. So this idea of reflecting on failure, looking at what they can do to better, helps them to kind of see how they are progressing. So that has been something that has been really helpful for me. The last thing I would throw out there is that by utilizing this idea of failure and error and taking it off of the grading average kind of stuff, what this actually allows us to do is to challenge students more, and it allows them to take risks. And so something like a quiz might not be part of that, but we do a lot of essay writing and all that in my class. If I have a student that gets a passing essay, or a student that knows they're going to get an A on that essay, they're a lot less likely to try new things. They're less likely to work on improving their style and all of that kind of stuff. They're fine. I've got an A, I'm good to go. But when we look at challenging them beyond that without it affecting their overall grade, then that frees them up to try things that they wouldn't normally try, because most students are not always going to sit down and write what comes to mind. They're going to write what they think you want to read, because they want to write out what's going to get them whatever that score is. And so again, by embracing failure, by embracing error, and by sitting down and doing things like reflecting on their work, it allows them to take some of those chances, to do things that they probably would not normally do because they would be afraid that it would negatively impact their grade on that assignment. And so when we free them up to do that, they take those risks, and even if they don't do it right, they still learn from it. And by learning from it, they grow, and then they become better anyway. So when my students are writing stuff, if they know that taking chances and trying new things is not going to negatively impact their grade on that writing, then they're going to learn and grow, and that's going to make them better writers anyway, regardless of what that grade ends up being. So as I kind of wrap up this segment, I just want to encourage everybody to try out this whole idea of embracing failure. And not just with your students. This is something that I have personally had to embrace. I've been that perfectionist kind of person, and I've had to really push myself to not hold myself to perfection. I always strive to do better and learn and grow, but I realize that I'm never going to be perfect. That's one of the reasons that I don't do a ton of editing on this podcast. I'll cut out like long pauses and maybe some major mess ups, but you'll probably hear my dog in the background, or you'll hear the door open when my 5-year-old daughter comes in and asks me a question without realizing I'm recording something, or those little ums and all that. I don't always edit those out, because this podcast is never going to be perfect. Nothing that I ever put together is probably ever going to be perfect. But what it is going to be the best version of what I can do. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge is to challenge ourselves and challenge our students to put together their best. And that brings me to my 8-Bit Crew question of the week. So I think that this idea of failure and using failure and mistakes to help improve learning is something that is really important these days and something that can be very useful in the classroom. So in this week's question of the week, I'm really curious to know, how can you implement this idea of failure is an option and this failure mentality in your classroom? Maybe you already are implementing some of that. So if so, what are some practical applications that you are using in your classroom? If you haven't done this yet, then what are some ideas that you can come up with your particular content area and things maybe that you have come across that would be good ways to implement that in class? You can respond to the question of the week on Twitter by using the hashtag 8BitCrew, or you can post longer comments on the episode page at 8bitinstructor.com. Hey, you don't want to miss next week's episode. Next week, I'm going to have a guest on here. Jared Cooney Horvath is coming on, and he's going to be talking a little bit about some brain science and how we learn stuff, ways that we can change our instruction to help students remember better, as well as diving a little bit into this whole failure idea, multitasking, if it's actually a thing or not. It was a great conversation, and you definitely don't want to miss that one next week. So that will just about wrap up this episode. Thanks so much for listening. Make sure to connect with me on Twitter at Comic Socks and use the hashtag 8BitCrew. You can also check out some of my other stuff on my blog at 8bitinstructor.com and some video stuff on YouTube at 8bitinstructor. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to hit subscribe on your podcast app and maybe leave a review as well. More importantly, tell some other folks who you think could benefit from listening and connecting and just creating a community of educators who want to create authentic experiences in their classroom, sharing ideas and all that. If you want to support the show, then you can visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/8bitinstructor. So until next week, keep leveling up that craft, and may your swords stay sharp and your shields hold strong. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and check out the 8-Bit Instructor YouTube channel for EdTech tips and tutorials, as well as other content on my website, 8bitinstructor.com. And of course, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Comic Socks and use the hashtag 8BitCrew. See you next week.